Hello and welcome back, and today it's another Before You Buy, and today I want to talk about using a NAS for video editing. So many of you are used to using old hard drives you've got knocking around, external USBs, whatever, or utilising bigger RAID configuration devices like the Drobo over here behind me to edit your video. You've been doing it for a long time, be it 1080p or even moving into 4K, and you've been editing all of this using software on your PC or your Mac. You connect to external storage, you do all your video editing on there, and then that gets moved over to somewhere else for metadata and distribution and all that kind of stuff. And you go on project to project to project, and maybe you back up to somewhere else. Maybe you don't even edit on the device there, but you still need to edit either locally onto your own client PC or Mac, or on a connected system. And many of you are starting to hear about the virtues, the benefits, some of the downsides too, of editing on a NAS system, a network attached storage device. Whereas the devices you've been using up till now, these external drives, stuff like that, are known as DAS, or Direct Attached Storage. And today I'm going to talk about the things you should know about editing on NAS, good and bad, and also good working practices when working on a NAS for video editing. So first and foremost, come on, let's plug it. Why should you use it? What are the benefits of editing on a NAS? Well, first and foremost, and probably the biggest advantage of editing video on a NAS is, of course, that it is one storage system, one box, one NAS that can be accessed by multiple people at once. Something that without some sophisticated software or workarounds is just not possible on a NAS. The ability to have one device that can be having 2, 3, 4 editors editing on it at the same time, if you've got enough storage media and connections, is really desirable. But then when you connect that device to a switch, connect that device to another network, more people can work on it. You can reinvent the workflow, and from a central storage area you can have editors working on it. You can have people adding the metadata, packaging up appropriately. You can have another bunch of people distributing it and sharing the file appropriately. And then finally, you can archive it either within the same system with multiple storage areas, or using the software inside to synchronize and migrate and work with off-site backup systems, or even connected USB or cloud backup systems. So again, a great advantage of NAS-based video editing is the fact that multiple users can connect at once with relative ease. The next thing is the diverse level of connectivity. Now, much like external storage takes advantage in the old days of things like FireWire and the higher spec USB these days, Thunderbolt, even eSATA at times, NAS is exactly the same. NAS isn't just a 1 GBE connection. You've also got connections like 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, 250 to 280 megs per second, 5 GBE connectivity in excess of 500 megs per second, 10 GBE, which is 1000 megs per second, and it gets higher into 25 GBE and 40 GBE. But not even just that, you've also got Thunderbolt as well, that allow you to interact with NASes in speeds that generally only until the last 5 or 6 years were either way too expensive to consider or just didn't exist. Modern NAS can allow greater external bandwidth for video editing, which has always been the big problem with editing on a NAS. The fact that you couldn't exceed traditionally 100 megs without spending a fortune meant your video software would lag, and the bigger projects were obviously accessing more archival footage remotely, which then slowed things down, and it just kept crashing. That's just not the case anymore, and there's loads of options out there, and I recommend you check them out. The third reason is the cross-platform support of editing on a NAS. Now, if you are running a Mac-only editing suite, in post-production, or you're running a mixed environment of PCs and Macs, with maybe the Macs doing the video editing and the Windows machines doing the metadata distribution, archiving and more, a NAS not only can be accessed by multiple people at once, but it can also work as a cross-platform sharing area. The one NAS can communicate with Mac and Windows systems, and the same files can be accessed. It doesn't need to be formatted to one or the other. It is its own storage area. Now, of course, more system-specific files, to Mac and its own file system, and to Windows and its own operating system, they're obviously going to be only usable by them. But it's the fact that they can both be visible, downloadable and accessible, all within a central method there, all between them. Now, Another big advantage of editing video on a NAS, and this is more long-term, is NASs are more scalable. Now, most DAS systems, and again, I'm talking probably slightly less about Drobo, but definitely more towards general large-scale storage. The storage you have at the beginning is pretty much all you get. You can't really chop and change drives, and it's certainly not very widespread as a concept to stick on an expansion. It's not unheard of, and a few DAS systems out there are smart enough to allow expandability, but it's by no means the majority and very much a small portion overall. They have RAID capabilities, sometimes in the system on a hardware RAID or SoC, software on chip RAID, or RAID on chip, or there's systems that require the PC that's connecting to the device to handle the RAID as well, which can be a bit dicey. With a NAS, not only is that RAID and stuff always taken care of internally, which is a real breath of fresh air, but on top of that, lots of NAS systems have scalable RAIDs that allow you to add more drives in their lifetime. They have flexible RAIDs in the case of Synology, which has SHR, Synology Hybrid RAID, which is a NAS alternative to Beyond RAID from the likes of Drobo. But on top of that, most NAS systems up above 4-5 bays allow expansions. You can add an expansion unit which has another bang 4 more drives, bang 8 more drives, bang 12 more drives, and you can scale that storage later as your archives get bigger, as your projects get bigger, whether you use these expansions or additional drives. As archival areas on the system ought to be shared by other people, it's still great to have that level of scalability on a NAS that is just not present in the same accessible and affordable way on DAS right now. And finally, not only can a NAS be accessed by multiple people at once, which again, very desirable, something that DAS doesn't really do, but all of those connected users can have their own password credentials, can have their own privileges, they can have restrictions, they can have read-only, read-write, or no access at all to certain databases, and you can create groups like staff or family members where you can move your users in and out of them so that these editors have only got access to the original recordings and nothing in the archive. You can have the distribution have no access to the original raw footage, but do have access to the finished projects only, and you can set it up and then move users as you need them with their own user credentials to and fro within the system, not only making sure your security is lovely and tight, but also making sure that errors don't happen between different team members in the workflow with your overall footage on the NAS. Editing video on a NAS has become very vogue and very, very popular in the last few years as projects get bigger and people that like to edit on internal NVMe's, which although very, very fast, are very small, and generally you're still then editing on your own system. That data has to move somewhere. So NASs are a reinvention of the workflow that can be very, very desirable and save a lot of time and therefore money in the long run. But it's not all good. Not everything's good about editing on a NAS, and it has its own shortfalls, and it would be very remiss of me to ignore that NAS is by no means perfect for 4K and 1080p editing, especially when compared to DAS. So first and foremost, sort of half touched on it earlier on, editing on a DAS, a USB drive, an external storage RAID device, an external Thunderbolt device, is always going to be faster for a like-for-like NAS system. If you have a 5-bay hardware RAID DAS and a 5-bay hardware RAID NAS with exactly the same media, the overall top performance possible will be higher on the DAS, because the DAS has got that single user architecture. The DAS doesn't have a bunch of software to run. It doesn't have to do things with internet and network protocol in mind. It's using traditional USB, traditional Thunderbolt, and more. The result is that a DAS will give you higher speeds overall. It will get more out of the drives inside in that RAID than it will on a NAS. But remember, it's one user having super fast speed, or in the case of a NAS, multiple users enjoying good speed, or even one user having good speed. And then it just comes down into a case of your workflow once again. Second thing, NASs like for like against DAS are more expensive. So not only for a single user do they not provide the same top end performance, but a NAS at the same number of drives scale to a DAS will cost more because of its functionality, because of the 24/7 build, because of the chips and the CPU and the memory and all of the architecture inside. NASes just cost more. So if you're on a tight budget, that may be a very good reason why you won't want to edit videos on a NAS. Next, NASes are not plug and play. They're getting closer and closer, and the way you can interact with them and save a connection, so interacting with it doesn't require a lot of mucking around with finding it on the IP or network. You can even use numerous client download tools for Synology, QNAP, Asus, TerraMaster, any of them, to allow you to use your native system software, again, a Mac OS, Windows, that sort of thing, or utilizing the software that you use for the editing. Rather than interacting with the NAS in its own software, you can use your own client UI and all your client software to interact with the NAS more and more now, but it's still nowhere near as easy as, once again, just sticking a drive in. Stick a drive, it appears. A NAS will never be as straightforward as that. It's getting close, as I say, with lots of defaults and stuff you can save, but it's still not quite as smooth as plug and play, and I think it's slightly more intimidating for a number of users. Also, if you want to edit on a NAS, it's worth highlighting that you will need additional kit. Editing with a NAS, like not so much this one, but if you were going to use maybe a 10 GB NAS or even a Thunderbolt NAS, just having the NAS isn't enough. Now, in most cases, maybe with the Thunderbolt NAS you can get away with just a simple cable, but if you're not using Thunderbolt and you're going to edit over 2.5G, 5G, 10G, etc., you're going to need upgrade cards on all of your devices. You're going to need adapters, 5GBE to USB adapters, Thunderbolt to 10G adapters. There are lots of ways in which you're going to have to upgrade your system, and that doesn't even include network switches that you may need to include in your architecture in order to make the most of your system. Let's leave that there on the table. So if you are looking to edit on a NAS, bear in mind that not only are you paying more like for like than a DAS, but also a lot of the time, particularly if you're going to reinvent the workflow, you're going to spend even more on the accessories in order to have that perfect workflow and removing any bottlenecks all the way through. So do bear that in mind. And finally, if you haven't already realized it throughout the course of the video so far, there is a steeper learning curve. Editing on a NAS, it's not as straightforward. It's not even just the plug and play stuff, but also you are dealing with the NAS over IP, internet protocol, the network and Ethernet connectivity. Even if you are connecting directly from one cable in your PC Mac to one cable inside the NAS and it's a single one back and forth, it's still nowhere near as straightforward and easy to set up for the first time and generally run maintenance than a DAS. So do bear in mind that although NAS has become a great deal easier in the last few years, it still has a bit more of a learning curve every single day while you're using it. It's very easy to wrap your head around, but just know it's not plug and play. So those are the main reasons why I would recommend a NAS for video editing and why I might not to different users. But before we end, we should talk about the key factors. These are the big deciding factors when choosing a NAS for video editing, because it's not just a case of that NAS looks good, let's have it. You have to really overthink your whole workflow. So first and foremost, the amount of storage you're going to need. You can't just look at your archive and go, I've got 3 terabytes. Yeah, we'll get a couple of 4 TBs, we'll be fine. It's really not that straightforward. The first thing you need to do is provision for the future. And if you're spending all this money, you need to know, look at your workload, look at the amount of data you've got and see how much you're going to need. Now, generally, I would recommend that you look at how much data you have and then you times that figure by 3 or 5 times. There's another way of doing it, looking at how much data you create over a year and then timesing that figure by 3 to 5, but I don't think anyone really knows that. I would recommend looking at how much data you've created right now and times 3 to 5 that number. That's how much storage you should start with. And even then, that is a conservative estimate because I don't know how long it took you to generate that data. Next, understand that when you go for RAID, redundant array of independent disks, where that is you've got multiple drives in a system like this one, understand that there are inherent advantages and disadvantages to different RAIDs. It's great that they give you, in most instances, 1 or 2 disks of failure, so if one of the disks dies, your data's not lost, but also know, and a lot of people overlook, that RAID configurations, larger RAID configurations and the right kind, actually give you tremendous speed boosts as well. So if you have an 8-bay in a RAID 5 or RAID 6, each one of those individual drives might give you 200 megs, give or take, of performance, megabytes per second, but each extra drive will add another 70 to 120 to 150 megabytes per second performance, depending on their architecture, if they're Pro or Enterprise disks or normal. So therefore, each disk will improve and overall increase that performance. So again, make sure you work out the right RAID configuration. Generally, I would always have at least one disk of RAID disk failure protection. Remember, RAID is not a backup, it's a safety net. Maybe 2 in a RAID 6, but I would say if you're going to edit on a NAS, minimum 8 disks. You're going to want 8 hard drives, whether you use SSDs as well, we'll touch on that in a bit, but definitely 8 disks minimum, because 8 disks, even in a RAID 5 or RAID 6, will give you an easy 800 to 1000 megabytes throughput, which is great for 10G, and I think a great little number to be starting with, in hard drive form at least, for video editing, thereby saving you having to spend a whole lot on SSD and not get the capacity that you might need for 1080p or 4K. Next, and this is kind of counter to my last point, these larger RAID arrays can make a bit of a racket. They're not the quietest, particularly when you use enterprise grade hard drives like this UltraStar drive here. This UltraStar 10TB drive is one of the highest performing drives in SATA you can get right now, but at the same time, it's one of the noisiest drives. Do check out my videos I did a few months ago about the noise level of drives. So let's go ahead and begin that noise test. I'm going to be quiet from now. These drives, if you have 8 of those, you can't work in close proximity to this. So if you're going to be editing on the NAS via Thunderbolt cables only really go up to about 3 to 5 meters max. That's going to be close enough that that noise, if you're not wearing lovely earphones to do your editing, is going to be really annoying. 10G, you can go up to about 20 meters on Cat traditional copper cables. With SFP, you can go further with a decent enough switch as well to extend that. So, but just be aware that larger NASs that you can use for video editing, the more enterprise level the architecture, and 8 bays will generally be in a metal chassis, they're going to be noisy, and that may affect the surrounding ambient noise, and therefore when you're working in close proximity to it. Now, I mentioned hard drives and SSD. We've got SSD, traditional SATA SSDs. We've got traditional hard drives or enterprise hard drives. We've also got NVMe SSDs. Do learn not only the difference between them, with the NVMe SSDs being the fastest, the SATA SSDs being the second fastest, and traditional hard drives arguably the slowest. Understand that each has its own inherent benefit. So normal hard drives are the lowest cost per terabyte, but unfortunately they are also the slowest. Traditional SATA SSDs are the best middle ground, 3 to 5 times the cost of normal hard drives, and you can get about 8 TB on some of these now quite affordably with half decent 3D TLC NAND inside. Finally, NVMe is by far the most expensive at around 5 to 7 times the cost of normal hard drives, and you can't really go higher than 2 TB, maybe 4 TB, but then you're looking at lesser quality NAND and they're less durable. So know that whichever one of those you go for, you can improve the performance by using certain hybrid storage methods. So one is caching, which allow you to use a large area of hard drives that are arguably slower, and then an SSD or two can then have the more frequently accessed files be moved, or not moved, but copied over to the SSD. So as they're more frequently accessed, those SSDs improve the performance. Then you could just create an area instead of one area on the NAS that's full of traditional hard drives and a smaller area filled with SSDs, be they traditional SATA or NVMe's. That means that the video editors can work off the super fast NVMe's, and the system using backup and sync software inside, available from all the brands, or then just copy the data over onto the slower hard drives, even making versioning backups that allow the editor to go back to older versions, but also allow the metadata users, distribution and archiving to all happen in the background on the slower arrangement. Finally, you've got tiering, such as Q-tier from QNAP, that allows you to use hard drives and SSDs inside, and it creates one giant storage area comprised of all of the storage, the super fast storage and the traditional slow starter storage, and then it moves files, doesn't copy, it moves key, more frequently accessed files over to those storage areas. Next, it's worth remembering that whichever NAS you go for, make sure you avoid any NAS that is an ARM based processor for video editing. These NASs are good, often arriving with 10 GBE on board, and they're incredibly affordable, so I can see why a number of you might go, oh, that looks pretty good. Don't fall for it. If you're going to edit video, do not get an ARM based CPU NAS. That CPU will just not be able to provide the throughput. Even if you get a NAS that's 4, 6, 8 bays or bigger, the problem is that even though you have all of those hard drives and that RAID and that great performance all the way through, that CPU for video editing and the huge amount of demanding read and write actions is just not going to cut it. And ultimately, you're going to have a very trying and difficult experience to edit on them. Always go for x86 64-bit processor chips that are quad-core in architecture above 2.0 GHz. If you are editing video over Thunderbolt, do go for a graphically enabled CPU. So we are talking an i3, i5, even an i7, or maybe the new W series Xeon, such as the one in the 88X series from QNAP. Same goes for memory. A lot of the NASs you're going to use for video editing, you want to go for one where the memory can be upgraded to at least 8 gig, I would recommend. Buy one that's got 4 gig but 8 gig minimum for video editing, simply because you are going to be holding a lot of big files live, and when you are editing larger video projects, you actually have lots of different files being accessed at once, not just one. And although a lot of the data will be kept in temp and shadow files on your client PC or Mac system, it has to be said that that extra bit of memory on the NAS, along with a more capable CPU, will result in much, much better results overall. Now, just having a look at my notes, it is worth remembering that if you are going for a 10 GBE NAS, whether you're using external adapters for it and you're using switches, bear in mind that just because a NAS features 10 gigabit Ethernet doesn't guarantee 1000 megs. When I talk about these NASs with 4, 6, 8 bays, I say that because all that the external gigabit connection does is open up a pipeline that can achieve that much. It allows you to achieve that much, but you need the drives inside to fill it. So bear in mind, a 10G NAS doesn't necessarily guarantee 1000 megs. That's why it was always strange when we see these 2-bay NASs with 10 GBE. As good as that is, and again, Asus Store, TerraMaster have done this as well, 2 bays are never going to give you in SATA 1000 megs. So if you see a good NAS that is 10 GBE, just remember you need the right amount of media inside in order to do it. And lastly, I've already mentioned this earlier on in the video, and I will mention it again, factor in the costs. If you are going to edit on a NAS, unless you're going to edit over Thunderbolt directly point to point, which even then, remember, is Thunderbolt over IP, bear in mind that editing on a NAS may well need additional accessories. I think it will pay off, and if you're using multiple people editing on the same source, you can claim that money back very, very quickly. But still, nonetheless, remember that you are going to need 10 GBE adapters if you're editing on 10 GBE. You're going to need 5G adapters. You're going to need to upgrade the PCIe slots on your PC or Mac systems, and upgrade the slots on some NAS systems that don't have 10 GBE by default. QM2 cards like this help you get around that with dedicated SSD bays inside, along with a 10 GBE port on the rear. And of course, as mentioned, you've got to make sure you've got the right storage media, but still nonetheless, editing video on a NAS, although incredibly attractive, does arrive with a lot of day one cost that I think a number of you need to bear in mind before you go down this road. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry this video has been a bit of a long one. This is a big, big subject to keep both broad and appealing, and at the same time cover everything, and I hope I've done the job for you guys. If I have, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. If you are looking to get an NAS for video editing and you're still on the fence and you don't know which one to go for and you need a bit of free advice, use the NAS compare section linked in the description. It's got me and Eddie the web guy there. We will answer your email. It's only manned by the two of us. It's not done for profit or anything like that. It's only done to kind of support the website and stuff. So if you need some free advice, go down there, ask us. Tell us a bit more information about what you need. We'll make some recommendations for you. It doesn't cost you a penny, so just go for it. Give it a run. Get some free advice. Why not? I will see you next time.